serious, lawyers of Reddit, what's the dumbest thing you've seen take place in front of the judge? People finding religion in front of a judge at sentencing. The judge would always respond with, "God may have forgiven you, but the state has not." That judge was a boss. Firm. Fair. And a total badass. Attorney, when was the last time you did drugs? Defendant on stand, checks watch. I had a judge ask my client if he could pass a drug test. He answered he could. And was sure because he hadn't smoked in 30 days. Case had been pending for 4 months. I'm doing jury selection on a civil case in California. It is going to be a long trial, 6 weeks, so the judge is giving jurors a lot of latitude if they claim any hardship for serving that long. After about 30 minutes of voir dire, which ended up taking 3 days and several panels, one guy stands up and says in very broken English that he can't follow. The judge asks him if he speaks English well enough to render a fair verdict, and he looks confused and says no. The judge thanks him for his service and dismisses him from the panel. In perfect English, accent now gone, he says, "Thank you very much, Your Honor. Where should I put my badge before I leave?" Judge found him in contempt and ordered him to stay for jury duty for the next week. Usually you just stay for 1 day if you don't get picked for a jury in that day. Your service is over. Saw one defense attorney demonstrate twerking during closing arguments of an assault with intent to kill trial. Part of me wants to make up my own story for this, but please. How exactly did that come about? I was in front of a judge for oral argument and the other side, proper, failed to show up. The judge called him and made him argue against our motion while driving and on his cell phone. The judge spoke for a minute setting up the arguments for the guy, basically leading him to the core argument and what he should be saying if he wanted to get our motion denied. After a few moments of silence, the guy responds, "Judge, I'm too stupid to understand what you just said." That ended the argument quickly and in our favor. We all forget to turn off our phones in court. But I once faced off against a lawyer whose phone rang right while he was in the middle of making his final submission to the judge. Even that might have been forgivable if he hadn't interrupted his submissions to take the call. In the UK this would be contempt of court and the lawyer would face criminal charges. Non-us lawyer, we once had a client who was arrested for fraud. The problem was his arrest warrant was riddled with errors. Half the time his name was changed to someone else's. The dates were wrong. And it ended by declaring the arrest warrant on the basis of robbery, not fraud. The client was actually, egregiously, guilty of committing fraud. But he walked a free man because here the arrest warrant has to be written with the accused's full name, the exact crime he is being accused of, and the date and place of said crime. Lesson to DAs and judges, don't copy paste without proofreading. The dumbest thing I've seen is a guy show up for not doing his community service in a shirt that said, "I'm not lazy. I just don't like to work." Judge asked him about it and he said it was his only clean shirt. Everybody had a good laugh, even the judge. A lot of clients want to speak up, but judge, you don't understand. But giving them the look of death and a jab in the ribs usually shuts them up pretty quickly. They're usually pretty okay. I found this gem doing some research one day, quoted from the case. As is evident from the foregoing excerpt from the transcript, the judge would not permit the appellant to speak to the issue of judicial bias. The appellant was agitated. The judge was, no doubt, frustrated. This exchange culminated in the appellant choosing to disrupt the proceedings by commencing to disrobe. The appellant described her actions to the judge as a form of non-violent protest which would continue until the judge would hear her motion for judicial bias. Wish I was there for that one. Seconds after being served with a protection from abuse order, opposing party flipped off the person who had obtained the order. And seconds after that approached her and asked if they could at least talk about it. Promptly arrested. I do family law. Told 11 clients in a row that they could be drug tested. 5-panel P-test, you need to be clean for about a week, as part of the custody evaluation process. 7 of them failed. You need to be clean for a week to pass everything but marijuana. Weed is detectable by a 5-panel for something like 2-4 weeks depending on how often you smoke. Edit. I'm not trying to be an ass. I just didn't want some poor soul to read this and gain false confidence. Client said to judge, well, that's your opinion. It went as badly as you'd expect. Thank you. Judge. No matter what happens, my objection gets overruled. Thank you. Judge. Lose my motion? Thank you. Judge. Judge says I'm fat, ugly and unlovable? Thank you. Judge. It was more what didn't take place. I was working for the DA's office and we had a guy scheduled to appear for a vandalism charge. The guy had a long history of minor offenses, but the judge was in a lenient mood that day. So the guy was probably going to get off light at the scheduled time. He hasn't shown up. His lawyer tells the judge he hasn't heard from the defendant that day. We wait 10, 20, 30 minutes. At the half-hour mark, the judge is furious. She angrily tells the lawyer to get out and find his client and get him before her, no matter what it took, or she drain hell down upon the defendant. An hour later, the lawyer slinks back into the courtroom. The judge sees him and interrupts another lawyer to call him up to the podium. The poor lawyer proceeds to tell us that the defendant didn't show up because he was actually sitting in jail 2 counters over, having been caught trespassing the night before. Needless to say, that defendant got the book thrown at him. During the direct examination of the defendant, the PD kept asking leading questions. After 5 or so sustained objections in a row, the judge had enough and sent the jury out of the room to yell at the PD. During the cross, about 10 minutes later, the judge again sent the jury out to yell at the defendant for trying to tell his story instead of just answering yes or no questions, not to mention he was clearly lying through his teeth. Also, the defendant was recorded committing the crime. So yeah, he was later found guilty. Crazy but sad, we had an elderly local attorney introduce an exhibit into a divorce hearing. Of course, we object to it. Somewhere in his argument into why it should be admitted, he got turned around and started objecting to his own evidence. Another time, a guy trying to get leniency on his 4th driving on revoked told the judge, "Your dad and my dad were cousins. We are family." Aside from the fact that that situation would also make the judge his cousin. In a small county, everyone are cousins far enough down the line. Had a client toss his car keys on the defendant table moments before sentencing for his 4th Audi. Judge asked how he got to court. Without blinking said, "I drove." Why? Good way to get a quick bail jumping charge for violating his no driving bail condition. At the end of a DWI trial, involving a pretty major wreck, in which the defendant was found guilty, the judge asked the defendant if he had anything he wished to tell the court during the sentencing phase. The guy thought for a second and said, "Your Honor, I'm real sorry. Normally I drive a lot more careful when I'm drunk." Lawyer here. I had a case where I was suing a les on behalf of her former les partner. It was a relationship property case. The one who was being sued put an issue whether they had even been lovers, or whether my client was just a flatmate or boarder in her home for the several years they lived together. I had no idea how I was going to prove that, but it turned out my client had saved all of the soppy love notes that her partner had left on the fridge, most of which were "I love you, you little squishy oyster" and other ribald descriptions. That issue sunk pretty quickly once the box of those were produced. On a hearing regarding a restraining order requested against him, a man raised the defense of HB trip-in restraining order granted. God bless General Sessions Court. During a plea hearing on a pros teach charge, the state proceeds to give the narrative of events. The SAR starts to get a little uncomfortable trying to describe the specific act that led to the arrest. We all know the line he's reading is "sucked his pen 15/big dick." But he's trying to find a nice way to say it for the record. He finally goes, "Where's she then?" UHH. Proceeded to perform. UHH. Fellatio. As soon as he says fellatio, the defendant stands up and straight up yells, I didn't do any of that French sheet. I gave him a BJ. When I was in law school, my school had a mock trial program that took place at the local county court, where the judges were actual judges, prosecutors, and attorneys from the local area. So one day, a mock trial is happening, and one student, who was a law student but not in the mock trial program, is acting as a witness being questioned on the stand. This person was getting a little too rude, acting in character. So the judge, who was an actual judge, admonished him to tone it down. The student didn't listen, so the judge took them to little side chat and told him he really needs to stop. The student blows up at the judge and tells him that he doesn't have to listen to a petty state court judge, and proceeded to verbally assault the judge. Judge filed an assault charge. Student was kicked out of school for damaging the school's relationship with the local courts. And I would imagine likely never got admitted to another law school, or if they did, would have a hard time passing the character and fitness test to practice law in that state. Unfair dismissal case. My client was summarily terminated for no reason. She recorded the dismissal on a dictaphone. The torrent of misogynistic, hateful abuse her boss spewed at her was unbelievable. He also assaulted her as she was removing the hands-free phone device from her car. Repeatedly slammed her leg in the door, causing a fracture, all the while screaming at the top of his lungs, "Duck you. You piece of shit." Suffice to say, we played that tape a million times in cross-examination. I will never forget, we had a defendant bust into the court from the local jail. His case was called and he promptly walked up the podium, looked the judge dead in the eye, and sheet his pants. Oh, jumpsuit. He knew he was going back to prison and just wanted to cause as much havoc as possible. People were gagging and there was a general sense of, did that just happen? In the air. This is a much longer story, but I'm on mobile. Anyways, a guy came into court on a pervert charge. His friend is a lawyer who comes into court with a black suit, snakeskin boots, and a bolo tie. It is glorious how slimy he looks. When he gets up to talk to the judge, he says, "I've known John for 20 years and he is a good man. He is not a pervert. So, I should know because I am one. I miss working for the DA." I'm going to start off with some context. This event took place on the first day of a murder trial in the Hong Kong High Court. Now, the official language used in the High Courts of Hong Kong is English and not Cantonese. The judge for this particular case was British, but the lead prosecuting attorney was from Hong Kong. Whenever he spoke, the judge had a hard time understanding him. To make things worse, the trial and evidence packet composed by the prosecution was a complete mess and did not include an English version. During the opening statement, the lead prosecution attorney decided that he needed to grab his colleague and act out the murder in order to get the message across. This was not pre-planned, and to make a long story short, the judge adjourned about an hour in to postpone the trial in order for the prosecution to sort out this mess. That was the dumbest thing I've ever seen in a trial, and I can't imagine how desperate the prosecution was to do such a thing. My favorite was a defense attorney in our courtroom giving his sentencing colloquy. This was for a charge of 6 with a minor. The attorney claimed that the defendant and the victim started out as friends, and then 6 just broke out. The judge responds, "What? Like a rash?" The defense attorney didn't have much to say after that, which was surprising by itself. A case where a large gangster-type defendant was accused of slashing the throat of a small skinny guy. The defense counsel made him wear a large coat to conceal his size, and brought in an interpreter to slowly translate each word of the proceedings because he had absolutely no understanding of English. 10 minutes into the trial, a cell phone goes off and rings for about a minute. The judge is furious and the ringing is amplified in the large courtroom. The hearing stops and everyone is looking around trying to figure out where the sound is coming from. Suddenly the defendant stands up and pulls the phone out of his pocket. It is still ringing, but only louder. The defendant then yells, "Hey judge, I don't know how to turn my phone off."